Thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to talk to you about this work, and also for inviting me to Paris. It's been such an intense day already, and also thanks a lot for still being here after such an intense day. I hope I don't bore you too much now. Anyway, so I just wanted to give a couple of words about myself, because even though I have a PhD in biostatistics, I kind of left biostatistics after my PhD. So I worked as a statistician at the Swiss National Science Foundation, where I kind of got into meta-research. So after that, I decided to go back to university and start a postdoc in meta-research. And we're in Zurich, my research mainly focuses on everything related to reproducibility, open science, and also research funding allocation systems. So you would just want to wonder how I got involved in this project on real-world evidence, which I actually don't have to introduce anymore. That's really good, because I'm not an expert on that. I'm an expert on things related to replication success. So this guy here, that's my boss, that's Leonhard Held. And in Zurich, we are interested in methods to quantify replication success. So that's a bit different from the things that you've heard so far. And in order to kind of get everybody on the same ship, because I realized whenever I talk about reproducibility, replicability, people understand different things. So just so you know that I understand behind those terms, starting with replication. So in this case, this would be a direct replication. This is defined as a study that follows exactly the same methodological steps or design that was presented in an original study, and it just collects new data. So you have the same methods, the same analysis, but new data. And that's a direct replication. So you can go further and do a conceptual replication. So in this case, you still have an original study, and from this original study, you kind of get like the fundamental idea or the hypothesis that you then want to test in a bit of a different setting. So the methods might change, or the treatment might change a bit, the population might change a bit. So you're taking it a bit further compared to a direct replication. And an emulation, as we've heard before, would be some kind of a special case of a conceptual replication, where you have an RCT, which in our case would be our original study, and you're emulating it in the real world, so the kind of the setting is a bit different compared to the original study. And you might also expect, as we've seen before, different results, but we still wonder what kind of, do the hypotheses or do the results still hold in a way? So we're interested in Zurich, kind of quantifying this replication success, and replication success really means, was I successful in a like 1 or 0 sense, a binary sense, or can I kind of quantify the evidence of these studies agreeing, so the original and the replication study? So this is how we got interested in this topic, because my boss, Leo, actually heard in a seminar just like this about the RCT duplicate initiative. And the RCT duplicate, so that stands for randomized controlled trials, duplicated, using prospective longitudinal insurance claims. So we have these real world data in there, applying techniques of epidemiology. And so what RCT duplicate did, this is an initiative where they emulated 32 clinical trial, randomized trials, that were, they were selected not at random, so there might be some selection bias in this 32 randomized clinical trials that they chose. So they chose the ones that were relevant in some way to regulatory decision making, and also that they were potentially feasible to even try and emulate. So there's things you have to consider as we've seen before. And they didn't only emulate in one of these databases, but they emulated their 32 clinical trials in 3 different, or up to 3 different databases. So these were independent emulation in the different databases. And that's why we then contacted these 2 people. So that's Shirley Wang and Sebastian Schneeweiss from the Harvard Medical School, who are kind of the the people behind this RCT duplicate initiative. So we contacted them and wanted to know if we could get the data. So kind of mainly, we were not so interested in how you actually emulate. We were really interested in the end game, like the original RCTs data, the results versus the real-world evidence results. So we started collaborating with the team, and just to tell you also how they defined in their initiative this replication, or in this case, emulation success. They actually had 3 different criteria of agreement. So they used full statistical agreement, and this meant that the estimates and the 95% confidence intervals of both the RCT and the real-world evidence study were on the same side of the null. And with this, they found 75% agreement. They then used an estimate agreement, which was defined as that the estimate from the emulation falls within the 95% confidence interval of the RCT. With this, they found a bit of a lower agreement score, like 66%. And they also used the standardized difference agreements, where they calculated the standardized difference, in this case between RCT and RWE, which stands for the real-world evidence, and checked whether it was lower than 1.96 and found 75% agreement. So overall, it was kind of a 70% agreement kind of average, which was rather high, and this might also be due to the fact that this was a bit of a biased selection maybe of the RCTs that they chose. So we then reanalyzed this data together with Shirley and Sebastian, and we didn't use all of the 32 trials, but only 29, because first we only used the ones that were, we only used the pooled estimates from, I said they were three independent emulations in 3 different data sets, and they were then pooled together with a fixed effects meta-analysis. And in some cases, they couldn't do the meta-analysis because of too much heterogeneity, and we just left them, we ignored them, that they existed. And we also only used trials where hazard ratios were the primary effect size, just to being able to compare the trials inside RCT duplicate, because just so you know, we are on a kind of a meta-meta level right now. So a meta-regression would just be all the, I don't know, the RCTs, but now we're comparing 2 pairs, RCT and RWE, in like this whole RCT duplicate initiative. So we're on a meta-meta level. Okay, so these are kind of the data that we're working with. So what you see on this plot, on the x-axis you have all the trials that we included, and on the y-axis the difference in hazard, on log hazard ratio. And what we want, if this would be perfectly emulated, the effect, like the estimate of the difference would be around 0, and you should kind of see this 0 line here, with of course some variation, natural variation. But we can see that they are a bit all over the place, some with very narrow confidence intervals, others with larger confidence intervals. And that kind of brings us to the problem and aim of this project. So the use of real-world data to support clinical practice and policy decisions has been questioned because you see these differences between RCT and RWE. And also the magnitude of these differences looks like it's a bit heterogeneous. They are all over the place a bit. And we want to see whether we can explain this. So actually, we want to see whether we can use methods from meta-analysis to first test whether there is heterogeneity in these differences, then quantify the heterogeneity, and see if we can use covariates to comprehend what the primary drivers are between these differences that we see in the results, and also see whether we can explain part of the heterogeneity of these differences using covariates. So it would be like a meta-analysis, just say. Okay, so we then started, and I'm going through these different steps one by one. So we started with testing if there is heterogeneity. So we do this just with standard meta-analysis methods. We computed the standardized difference that we've seen before, which should follow, if there were no heterogeneity and no biases, should follow a standard normal distribution. We can square this, and that this leads us to the Q test of heterogeneity, within the RCT and RWE pairs. And then we sum this squared standardized differences to have like an overall test of heterogeneity in all of RCT duplicate. So these are then the results, and the most important is this overall p-value. So like the first plot there on the, I never know what right and left is, so on your side it's left. So these are just the standardized differences of the trials, which should follow a standard normal distribution. And then here we have the p-values of the q-tests, and then this overall p-value of heterogeneity. And from this, because the p-value is quite small, we would conclude that there is evidence of heterogeneity between trials or between trial differences. Okay, so now we said, okay, there is heterogeneity. Can we measure the heterogeneity? So there's different ways of measuring heterogeneity. And you can either use a multiplicative adjustment of your standard deviation or an additive version. At the end of the day, what we call the heterogeneity in this case is really this variance inflation parameter. So the first one, the multiplicative one, is this phi, and the additive one is the tau squared. And if you are familiar with meta-analysis, you are pretty familiar probably with the tau squared. So at the end of the day, to kind of compute these tau squared, we would just do a random effects meta-analysis, like with just R, which is the metaphor package. But we actually focused on the multiplicative one because it's a very easy implementation. It is just a weighted linear regression where we're using weights that, like, the outcome for this regression are going to be the, I don't know if you see the, no you don't, are just going to be the differences, and the weights are going to be the inverse variance of these differences. So like I said, we focus for this project on the multiplicative heterogeneity because we believed it was a pretty easy implementation. So at the end of the day, you just compute a weighted linear regression and you take out the standard error of your regression model. And then we ended up with a multiplicative heterogeneity of 1.9, which doesn't tell you anything. The only thing it tells you is it is larger than 1, and if we wouldn't have heterogeneity, it would be 1, so it is larger than 1, so there might be something going on. But whether this is now high or low, it's a bit hard to judge, and that's why people usually use things like I squared to kind of make it a bit more on a relative scale. But we actually didn't do that. We went on with this phi, and we're now wondering whether we can kind of shrink this heterogeneity of 1.9 towards 1 by just adding covariates in our, I forgot the word, weighted linear regression model. So really pretty straightforward. So how would we do this? We would just add a set of p-candidate covariates into a model. So you see here, again, the variance component there multiplied by phi, which is now phi tilde. And the covariates are just added in our linear predictor. And now this heterogeneity, is now the residual heterogeneity, which has been defined as the variability in the true outcomes, and the outcomes are the differences between the estimates that cannot be accounted for by the moderators. Okay, so we did this in RCT duplicate. We tried to add a covariate, and we started with a covariate that they liked very much, which was a covariate, it's a composite covariate, They called it close emulation, and it was an ad hoc variable that they created after performing RCT duplicate to kind of give a sense to whether this was now a closely emulated or not closely emulated. And I put the definition of this composite variable here, but it's not so interesting. It's just, like, for now at least, just to know that it was based on other variables that they decided whether it was close or not. And if I then plot, again, the differences in log hazard ratio, but color the points based on whether it was a close emulation or not, we could already see that maybe the ones that were not closely emulated These are the, oh, you do see my mouse. The red ones, they tend to be more positive than the others, so maybe there is something going on with this variable. So let's just put it in our model and see what comes out. So that's what we did here. So the first line, you see again like the simple model, just a null model without any adjustment, which gives us this heterogeneity of 1.9. We add close emulation and we end up with a heterogeneity that is a bit smaller, it's 1.72, so we managed to shrink it down a bit. And we can also directly now interpret this coefficient. So like I said, it looked like if there is a close emulation, the difference is lower. And if I say the difference is lower, means that the RCT, the estimate in the RCT, is larger than that of the RWE, of the real-world evidence. Okay, and if you look at this from a like prediction interval perspective, so we can now, using this model, compute prediction intervals based on this variable, close emulation, and yeah, the bubbles are just the trials, and yeah, again, we see that if there is a close emulation, the differences tend to be lower than 0, but with no close emulation, they are above the 0 line. Yeah, but I was not so happy with this composite endpoint because it was very arbitrary and ad hoc. So I was wondering what happens if we, instead of using this close emulation composite endpoint or covariate, we just put the variables that are part of this composite covariate in the model by themselves. So that was what we did next. So what we see on this slide is just like a part of the table with each trial and then the different covariates. So we have here 10 potential covariates that we could add in our model. And these are things like, how was the comparator emulation judged? Was it good or bad, or like poor or moderate? Same for the outcome emulation. Was there differences in the mean age, etc.? So we, however, only had 29 trials, so we don't want to run into overfitting by just throwing in to our model all these 10 covariates. So we decided to do some variable selection with leave one out, mean squared error, and then ended up with a model including 3 binary covariates. So one of those was, for example, delayed onset of the effects of the drugs. So that meant that it just took some time for the drug to work. And this is relevant because in an RCT, the people would just be, I don't know, stay on the drug. But in the real world, they might not see any changes to their conditions and then stop taking the drug, etc. So it's a bit problematic for the emulation. Another one is, for example, the treatment started in the hospital. Again, that's something that is, they used claims data. So this is not really, well, it's not possible to emulate this in the real world data. So these 3 covariates were chosen by our variable selection. And with this rather small model, we managed to kind of end up with a residual heterogeneity of 1. So there was no heterogeneity in our model anymore. And then if we look at this same bubble plot, this time with here on the x-axis, it's a bit small, I'm sorry. This is the combination of these 3 binary covariates. They were also mutually exclusive in the end. So if one was true, the others were all no or false. And then here, which is interesting, is again, we have the prediction intervals. And if all these 3 covariates were set to no, which means that it was actually easier to emulate, we have again a negative, or the prediction interval would tend towards like negative differences compared to the others. The moment one of those binary covariates was set to true, they were on the other side of the null. Okay, so just a few words on the discussion and limitation. So we managed to, by using only 3 covariates, to reduce the heterogeneity from 1.9 to about 1. And which is also important is that these 3 covariates were part of this composite endpoint, this composite covariate, that the RCT duplicate team just post hoc made up. So this means that actually the other covariates that they added into closed emulation just added noise into this closed emulation. This could now, in some way, inform the planning and interpretation, mainly of future emulation efforts. But very importantly, our main limitation is the current availability of data on these things. So to do such a meta-regression, we need a lot of emulations and all these covariates. And yeah, there's just not much out there currently. So it's also a call for the people who are emulating to maybe collect these things on a standard basis and open up their data so that meta-researchers can come and put everything together. And together with Leo Held, who you've seen on the first slide, we also extended this approach to location scale meta-regression. So what we've seen before, these like more simple meta-regressions, we actually modeled only the location. But we were wondering, but because the heterogeneity is actually the scale. So can we add covariates to the scale component of a model? We couldn't do this with the RCT duplicate because it's just 29 trials, so we used another project, which are reproducibility, these large reproducibilities project, of which you might have heard of. And yes, so that works, but it's published as a preprint, but we're still trying to get it published. Wasn't that easy. Anyway, so these are my references, and thanks a lot for the attention.